3 weeks, that's how long it took me to figure out the thing circling our cabin at night wasn't the threat. 3 weeks of my wife sleeping with her back pressed against mine, and both kids dragged into our bed by midnight, and a loaded .30-06 leaning against the bedroom door. The whole time, the actual danger was further out in the trees, watching the cabin through a different set of eyes than the ones I thought were watching us. And the thing I'd nearly put a bullet through, the thing I was sure had come to kill my family, was the only reason we lived through that summer. I'll try to tell this straight. My name's Cal Mercer. The cabin sits in Wexford County, Michigan, about 40 miles southeast of Traverse City, on a piece of land that's been in my family since my great-grandfather bought it cheap in 1923, when the lumber boom had stripped the place down to stumps and nobody wanted second-growth hardwood full of brush. The land sits up against the back edge of the Manistee National Forest. The federal land takes over right where our property ends, and there's no road in for about 8 miles in any direction. Closest paved surface is M37. Closest neighbor is a guy named Hap Lindeman, whose family's been up there as long as ours has, and his place is 2.5 miles north through woods you wouldn't want to walk after dark. I inherited the place last spring when my grandfather Erskine died, pancreatic, quick. He was 84, and he'd been living up there alone since my grandmother passed in 2009. The cabin was in worse shape than the lawyer let on. Roof leaking in 2 spots, pump house full of mice. The whole north wall had gone soft from a slow leak nobody had caught. My wife Brenna and I talked about it for about a week. We could sell. The land alone was worth real money, even with the cabin half rotten. Or we could fix it up and have a summer place. We'd been looking at houses in Grand Rapids that were out of our price range, and Brenna's job had gone remote in 2021 and stayed that way, and I'd just gotten laid off from my second mechanical engineering job in 3 years. So we pulled the kids out of school 2 weeks early and packed the Subaru and drove up to spend the summer working on the cabin. The kids are Hollis, who was 9 that summer, and Marin, who was 6. The dog is Banjo, a beagle mix we'd had since before Hollis was born. 12 years old by then and starting to slow down but still sharp. A dog who'd bark at a leaf landing on the porch and then look at you like you were welcome. First week was fine. I mean, it was a lot of work. The first 3 days I just hauled out what Grandpa Erskine had let pile up. Boxes of paperwork going back to the 70s, a whole closet of canned peaches my grandmother had put up in 006, a stack of National Geographics from the 80s, tall enough to use as a side table. But it was the good kind of work where you can see what you accomplished at the end of the day. And the kids were running around the property like animals released back into the wild. They'd been cooped up so long in the Grand Rapids house that the woods hit them like a drug. Brenna set up an office in what used to be my grandmother's sewing room. She took her calls in there with the door closed and a Yeti tumbler of coffee. The cell signal was bad, but workable if you stood near the kitchen window. I patched the roof by the end of week 1. Got the soft wall opened up and started drying it out. Made dinner most nights on the propane stove because the new range hadn't been delivered yet. That was the easy part. The first thing I noticed was the second week, around Tuesday or Wednesday. Banjo started waking up in the middle of the night and standing at the front door. Not barking, just standing there with his hackles up and his head tilted, listening to something I couldn't hear. He'd hold that pose maybe an hour, then come back to bed. I'd lie there listening too, and I wouldn't catch anything. Wind in the maples, an owl every so often. Nothing that should have spooked an old dog. Brenna asked about it the third night it happened. She's a light sleeper. She'd seen me get up to check on him. I told her it was probably a raccoon. We'd seen scat on the porch the morning before, a big pile. The kind that makes you stop and reassess what size raccoon is hanging around your house. She gave me the look she gives when she's about half sure I'm lying to her, and went back to sleep. The first knock was Friday of that week. 2:30 in the morning. I know because the digital clock on the dresser was facing the bed, and I'd been staring at it for 10 minutes, trying to figure out why I was awake. Then it came. 3 knocks, not on the front door. On the wood of the cabin itself, somewhere around the back, where my grandfather's old workshop juts out as a 1-story addition. Knock, knock, knock. Evenly spaced. The kind a person makes when they're announcing themselves, but don't want to seem rude about it. Banjo lost his mind. He went from a dead sleep to barking so loud, I was sure he'd wake the kids. Brenna sat up next to me and grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me with her eyes very wide. I got up. Went to the kitchen window first, because it had the best angle on the back of the property. The motion light over the workshop door was on, which it shouldn't have been. Nothing in the cone of light, just the gravel and the wood pile, and the edge of the forest about 15 feet beyond. I waited. Banjo was still going off in the bedroom. The motion light clicked off. About 10 seconds later, it clicked back on. Still nothing. Just empty light spilling onto empty gravel. I got my grandfather's old 30-06 out of the bedroom safe. Brenna was up by then, in her robe, holding Marin who'd woken up crying. Hollis was standing in the hallway with his hair sticking up, asking what was happening. I told them to stay in the bedroom and lock the door, and I went outside. The air was cold for June, maybe 55 degrees. The motion light had clicked off again. I stood on the back porch with the rifle in both hands and my eyes adjusting to the dark, and I listened. Nothing. The woods were doing their normal thing. Crickets, a frog somewhere, wind moving through the canopy in slow, heavy passes. I walked around the workshop with a flashlight. The siding looked normal. No marks, no damage I could see. I checked the door, locked, windows intact. I shined the light at the ground, and that's where I found something, a track. One. In the soft dirt at the corner of the workshop where the gutter dumps when it rains. It was big, 12, 13 inches long, 4 toes splayed wide. A pad behind them that was wider than the toes. No clear claw marks, or maybe claw marks so subtle I couldn't make them out in the flashlight beam at 2:30 in the morning. Not a bear. Bear tracks have 5 toes. Not a wolf. Too big and the wrong shape. Wolves don't come this far south in the lower peninsula anyway. Coyotes are smaller. The proportions weren't right for any canine I'd ever seen. But the shape was canine. The toes spread the way a dog spread. The pad was a dog's pad. Just enormous. I'm an engineer, I think in measurements, and the measurements weren't adding up to anything I could name. There are no dogs in northern Michigan with feet that size. There aren't dogs anywhere with feet that size. I took a picture with my phone. It came out blurry because my hands weren't steady. Then I went back inside and locked the door and told Brenna it was probably a bear and we should go back to sleep. She didn't ask if I believed myself. I think she could tell I didn't. I want to back up here for a minute because I know how this sounds. I'm a guy who does industrial mechanical design. I do load calculations and read shop drawings. I do not believe in cryptids. I had a roommate in college who watched Monster Quest religiously, and I made fun of him every single night for 3 years. So, when I tell you that the next morning I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and Googled Michigan dogman, I want you to understand, I did it the same way you'd Google a weird rash you found, which is to say with the absolute certainty that whatever I'd find would confirm what I already knew, which is that it was nothing. What I found wasn't nothing. The Michigan dogman has been reported in Wexford County since at least 1887. There's a guy named Steve Cook, a DJ at WTCM in Traverse City, who wrote a song called The Legend as an April Fool's joke in 1987 and started getting flooded with real sighting reports. Lumberjacks in Wexford County had claimed back in the 1890s that they'd seen a creature standing on its hind legs with the head of a dog. There's something called the Beast of Bray Road in Wisconsin that fits the same description. The reports trace back further than that if you go into Anishinaabe oral tradition, though there it's a different category of being entirely. And I want to be careful not to flatten that into something it isn't. The point is, Wexford County, where I was sitting, where I'd found a track the size of a dinner plate at 2:30 in the morning, and I'd never heard about any of this in my life, even though I'd been coming up to this cabin since I was 8 years old. I went and asked Hap. Hap is in his late 70s, built like a fire hydrant, lives alone in a place that's been added on to so many times it looks like 4 different houses leaning against each other. He was on the porch when I drove up, and he didn't seem surprised to see me. He just nodded at the truck and waited for me to climb out. I'd known Hap since I was a kid. He used to give me hard candies out of a tin on his kitchen windowsill. I never thought of him as scary, but that morning, when I told him what had happened and showed him the picture of the track, his face changed in a way I'd never seen before. Not scared, worn out, like a guy hearing news he'd been waiting on for a long time. "How long you up for?" he said. I told him we were staying the summer. "With the kids?" "Yeah." He sat with that for a while, took a sip of his coffee, which he drank black out of a chipped mug. "Cal," he said, "I don't want to scare you, but you got 2 choices. You can pack up and go home tomorrow morning, or you can sit down and let me tell you what your grandfather and I worked out 50 years ago. Because if you're staying, you gotta know." I sat down. What Hap told me that morning, I'm going to try to give it to you the way he gave it to me, because there's no version of it that sounds less crazy than it actually was. He started in 1971. He said, "Your grandfather and I had a summer like the one you're having." He didn't mean a summer exactly like ours. He meant a summer where you find a track you can't explain and you don't sleep right anymore. In 1971, Hap was 23, just back from Vietnam, living with his folks in the house he now owned alone. My grandfather Erskine was 34, married to my grandmother, with my dad already born and another kid on the way. Erskine was doing the same thing I was doing, patching the cabin, trying to make a real place out of it instead of a hunting shack. Hap said it started in late June for them. Same way. Banjo's grandfather Banjo, more or less, except theirs was a German shepherd named Captain. Captain started standing at the door at night. Then there was knocking. Then there was a track. Erskine went to Hap's father, who was still alive then, and Hap's father, who was a Methodist minister, of all things, told Erskine to come back that night and they'd go for a walk. My old man, Hap said, he walked your grandfather out past the stone, and they sat for about 2 hours, and your grandfather came home the next morning, a different man. What stone? I asked. Hap looked at me like I should already know. You been here all your life, and nobody showed you the stone? No. He shook his head. Your grandfather meant to. He just kept putting it off, I expect. Some things you don't want to teach a kid until you have to. The stone is on our property, about a quarter mile behind the cabin, past the workshop, past the old propane tank, in a little depression in the ground that you can't see from the cabin because the land rises behind the workshop and then drops down again. It's not really a stone, it's a marker, a piece of granite about 4 feet tall, set into the ground at an angle, with marks cut into the face that aren't any alphabet I know. Hap took me out to it that afternoon. He said my great-grandfather had set it there in 1924, the year after he bought the land, with help from a man whose name I should remember, but I can't because Hap only said it once, and it was long, and I didn't write it down. The marks on the stone aren't ancient. They're maybe 100 years old, but what they represent, according to Hap, is older than that by a lot. There's an arrangement, he said. He was standing next to the stone, with his hands in his coat pockets, looking down at it the way you'd look at a grave. Your great-grandfather worked it out when he bought the place. There was already something here, something old, and there were other things too, further out, that wanted to come through. The thing here, the one that walks the property at night, it doesn't want what's further out to come through any more than we do. So the family kept the place. We kept it lived in. We kept the offerings going at the stone, and the thing kept the rest of them out. I asked him what the thing was. He took a long time answering, long enough that I watched a chickadee land on a low maple branch about 20 feet away and just sit there preening for a full minute. I don't know, he said finally. Your grandfather thought he knew. He spent 40 years on it. He had theories. Most of his theories ended up in a journal he kept in the bottom drawer of the desk in the workshop. You go look at that journal tonight, then you come find me tomorrow and we'll talk again. You'll have questions I can't answer. Some of them your grandfather couldn't answer either, but you'll know what you're dealing with. I asked him what the offerings were. He nodded toward the stone. Meat, half a deer's worth, 4 times a year. Roughly the solstices and equinoxes. But you don't have to be precise. Just regular. You wrap it in cloth and you leave it on top of the stone after sunset and it's gone by morning. Your grandfather did it for 50 years. Your dad never did because your grandfather never told him. Your dad was raised here too, and your grandfather didn't want him to carry it, so he carried it himself. He figured he'd live forever, maybe. Or he figured one of you boys would come back to the cabin eventually, and he'd have time to explain. Then he didn't. I asked when the last offering had been. April, Hap said. Right after Erskine got sick, I did it myself. I haven't been out here since. I figured I'd give the place a few months and see what showed up. He looked at me with eyes that were tired in a way I hadn't earned the right to see. You showed up, he said, and then your dog started barking at the door. So, here we are. I sat with that. Then I asked him how his father had learned, where this had started. Hap took a long sip of his coffee. My old man learned in 1947. His father, my grandfather, had been carrying it since 1924, the same year your great-grandfather set the stone. The two of them, my grandfather and your great-grandfather, they were the ones who worked the arrangement out together. They'd both come up here from downstate around the same time. They knew each other from a planing mill in Manistee where they'd both worked before the war. They bought adjacent properties because they wanted to live close to people they trusted. And what they found when they started clearing the land was that the woods on both their pieces had something in them that wasn't on any of the other properties along this stretch. Hap took another long drink. Your great-grandfather and my grandfather, they took the problem on together. They figured out the offerings together. They worked out the boundary together. They set the stone where they did because it sat at the closest point between the two properties to whatever was past it. The arrangement was always supposed to be carried by both families, the Mercers and the Lindemans. As long as both families stayed on the land, the arrangement held. If one family left, the other one had to absorb both halves of the carrying. I asked him if his family had ever left. Not yet. My uncle thought about selling in the 60s. My old man talked him out of it. My uncle moved to Florida anyway, but he sold the back parcel to my father. So the land stayed in the family. I'm the last one of us. I never had kids. So when I go, the Lindemann half of this thing goes with me. And then it's all on you, Cal. The whole carrying. Both halves. He looked at me with a kind of apology in his face, like he was sorry he hadn't told me this part right away. That's why you came home and your dog was at the door. I'm 78 years old. I've got maybe 10 years if I'm lucky and the weather is kind. The Watcher knows that. And he came to your great-grandfather 100 years ago, and now he's coming to you because there's nobody else left to come to. I sat with that. The chickadee from earlier had moved to a different branch, but it was still on the porch, watching us in that small, unconcerned way birds have. I asked him one more thing before I left. I asked him if his father had ever been afraid. Hap thought about it. He was afraid the first time he went past the stone. He told me that. But after he'd carried it a while, the fear shifted. He used to say what scared him wasn't what was past the stone. It was what would happen to the people downstate if the line ever broke. He used to say, every once in a while, with no warning, that he thought about Manistee, about Cadillac, about the towns, and what those towns would look like in a few months or a few years, if what was past our stone ever got out and started moving south. I went home and I read the journal that night. The journal was 4 notebooks, composition books, the kind with the marbled black and white covers. Erskine had labeled them with masking tape. Watchers I, Watchers 2, Watchers 3, arrangement. The handwriting was tight and neat, the way men of that generation wrote when they wanted something to be taken seriously. I sat at the kitchen table after Brenna and the kids were in bed, and I read until almost 4 in the morning, and I'll try to summarize what was in those notebooks because the full version would take all night. My grandfather wasn't religious in any way I'd ever noticed. He went to church for funerals and weddings, and that was it. But after the thing started walking around the cabin in 1971, after Hap's father took him out past the stone for whatever happened that night, my grandfather started reading. He started with the Bible. Then he moved on to the Apocrypha. Then he got into what Christian scholars call the pseudepigrapha, which is the stuff that was almost in the Bible and got cut. And the book he kept coming back to was the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch is real. You can buy it on Amazon. It was excluded from the canonical Old Testament by most Christian traditions, but it's still considered scripture by the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, and pieces of it were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, so it's at least 2,000 years old. The first section, what scholars call the Book of the Watchers, describes a group of angelic beings called Watchers, who came down to earth in the time before the flood. There were 200 of them, led by one called Semjaza. They came down on Mount Hermon. They took human women as wives. The children of those unions were called Nephilim, and they were giants. And they were monsters in the way that things made out of 2 categories of being can be monsters. They ate too much. They turned on humans. They taught humans forbidden things, metalwork and warfare, and the writing of charms. Then God sent the flood. The Nephilim died in the flood mostly. The Watchers were bound. Most of them were chained beneath the earth in different places, waiting for a judgment that hadn't come yet. One of them, called Azazel, was bound in the desert at a place called Dudael. And then there's a part of Enoch that my grandfather had underlined 3 times. After the Nephilim died in the flood, their spirits, which were unclean because they were half angelic and half human, didn't go where dead human spirits went. They stayed. They wandered. They became, in the language of the book, evil spirits upon the earth. And they cause oppression and bring about destruction and cause hurt. And they're invisible. But they bind themselves to places, and at certain places they gather, and at those places they try to find ways back into the physical world. My grandfather's theory, as he laid it out across 4 composition books over 40 years, was that our property sat on top of one of those places. Not a major one, not Mount Hermon, just a minor seam in the world, a place where the dead Nephilim spirits had been drawn for a long, long time, and where, if left alone, they could eventually thin the wall between where they were and where we were. That was the bad news. The good news, if you can call it that, was the thing that walked our property at night. Erskine had no name for it. He called it the Watcher, in lowercase. He drew sketches in the 3rd notebook, a figure about 7.5 feet tall, bipedal, the head of a dog or a wolf, long-muzzled, with ears that swiveled, yellow eyes, the body covered in coarse dark fur. The hands ended in fingers, not paws, with claws that could carve into rock and stone. The proportions were almost human, but the spine was wrong, the legs were too long, the shoulders too broad. He didn't think it was a watcher with a capital W. The capital W Watchers, according to Enoch, were bound. He thought, and he wrote this out very carefully in the third notebook, that the thing on our property was something else, something older, or something that had chosen a side. He had a Hebrew scholar he wrote letters to in the 80s, a guy at the University of Michigan, and the scholar had told him about a tradition in some of the more obscure rabbinical writings that not all the Watchers had fallen with Semjaza. Some had stayed. Some had been sent down later with different jobs. The job of these later ones was to keep watch over the seams, the places where the dead Nephilim could gather and try to push through. They were jailers, basically. The capital W Watchers were prisoners. The lowercase Watchers were guards. That was the theory. There was more in the notebooks than the theology. Erskine had documented things the way an engineer documents things, which is to say with dates and times and notes about conditions. The first notebook had a log going back to August 14th, 1971. The first entry was 3 lines. Captain barking at door, 2:14 a.m. Sound from north side of cabin like knocking. No tracks, no sign in morning. 3 knocks, evenly spaced. Same pattern as the one before. Same pattern as the one before. That meant there had been an earlier one Erskine hadn't documented yet. He'd written it down after the fact, knowing what he was looking at by then. The log went on from there for 50 years. Knock dates, track sightings, times of the offerings, notes about the Watchers' appearances. Some years there were only 6 or 7 entries. Other years, the bad years, there were over 30. The bad years tended to cluster. 1978 was bad. 91 was bad. 2008 was bad. Erskine had a note next to 2008 that just said recession, with a question mark, like he was working out whether human upheaval somehow agitated whatever was past the stone. Then there were the letters. Erskine had kept carbon copies of the letters he sent to a Hebrew scholar at the University of Michigan. The scholar's name was Yair Friedlander, and he died in 2014, so I couldn't write to him myself. But the letters were there, both sides of the correspondence going back to 1984. Friedlander had been cautious at first, in his replies, the way an academic is cautious with a layman writing to him about a topic the layman shouldn't know anything about. By the 3rd letter, he'd softened. By the 5th, he was sending Erskine pages of his own translations from sources Erskine wouldn't have been able to read on his own. By the 10th, he was writing things like, "I would be interested to hear about your land," and "I think your situation may be unique in the literature I know of." One letter from Friedlander, dated October 1987, had a passage in it that Erskine had underlined and starred. I'll try to give it to you the way it read. There is a class of beings discussed in certain marginal commentaries that I have not seen referenced in English language scholarship. The Hebrew term for them translates approximately as those who watch the seams. They are distinguished from the Watchers of Genesis 6 and the Book of Enoch in that they were not part of the original descent. They were sent later, after the flood, with a specific assignment connected to the dispersal of the Nephilim spirits. Some commentators consider them angels who chose obedience. Others consider them an entirely separate order of being, perhaps something older. The references are scarce and the texts are scattered, but I find your description of the figure on your property consistent with what the marginal commentaries describe. That was the letter that had broken Erskine open, I think. Up until 1987, his notebooks had the tone of a man trying to talk himself out of what he was experiencing. After 1987, the tone changes. He's no longer asking whether what he's dealing with is real. He's asking what his job is. I read all of that, and I closed the notebook, and I sat there in the kitchen at 3 in the morning with a cup of cold coffee in front of me, and I thought, my grandfather went insane sometime around 1973, and we never noticed because he was already so quiet. I almost threw the notebooks out the next morning. I really did. I pulled them out of the drawer, and I carried them to the burn barrel, and I stood there with the matches in my hand. Then I thought about the track at the corner of the workshop, and I thought about Hap's face when I showed him the picture, and I put the notebooks back in the drawer. I called my dad that morning. He lives in Tucson now, retired, in a place he and my mom moved to after she got the diagnosis 15 years ago. He's a regular guy. He played golf for 30 years. He never had a thought about the metaphysical in his life, which I think is how Erskine wanted it to stay. I asked him, casually, if he remembered anything weird about the cabin from when he was a kid. Any stories his dad had told him. Any reason the family had stayed so attached to a piece of property that didn't really have any economic value anymore. He thought about it. He said, "Your grandfather was strange about that place. He'd go up alone sometimes and not tell anyone where he was. Your grandmother used to say he had a girlfriend up there. She was kidding, mostly, but she also wasn't sure. I asked if he'd ever gone past the workshop as a kid. There was a long pause. Then he said, "Why are you asking that, Cal?" I told him I was just curious about the property, doing some exploring. He didn't buy it. He said, "Your grandfather told me exactly once that I wasn't allowed past the workshop. I was about 8. We were up there for a week in the summer. I'd been climbing over the workshop wall and walking around behind it just to see what was back there. He caught me. He didn't yell. He sat me down on the porch and he said, the woods past the workshop weren't safe and that I had to promise him I'd never go back there, even when I was older. He made me promise on my own life. 8 years old." My dad laughed, but it was a thin laugh. "I never went back there. I never even thought about it. I just took the rule and folded it up somewhere. I never told anyone. I didn't think anything of it. I asked him if he ever wondered what was back there. Sometimes," he said. "Not as much as you'd think. Some part of me knew not to wonder. I think that was the deal he made with me without saying it. I didn't ask. He didn't have to explain. Honestly, Cal, until this conversation right now, I don't know that I've thought about that promise in 40 years. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Is there something I should know? Are you in trouble up there?" I told him I was fine. I told him we were having a great summer. I told him Brenna and the kids loved the cabin. I told him I'd call him in a couple weeks. I hung up. I sat at the table for a long time after that. I thought about my grandfather looking at his 8-year-old son and making him promise on his own life never to go behind the workshop. I thought about what it must have cost Erskine to keep my dad out of the arrangement, knowing his son would feel a vague, unexplained pull toward the property for the rest of his life and never know why. I thought about whether I'd ever do that with Hollis or Marin, and I knew right then, sitting at that table at 10 in the morning, with my dad's voice still in my head, that I wouldn't. I wasn't going to carry it the way Erskine had. If I was going to live with this thing, the people I loved were going to live with it knowing. The next 4 nights were quiet. No knocks, no motion light. Banjo slept through. I started to convince myself that maybe whatever it had been had moved on. I didn't go out to the stone. I didn't leave an offering. I told myself I'd do it the next weekend, when I had time to drive into Cadillac and buy enough meat. The truth is I was hoping the whole thing would just stop, that I could pretend the track had been something else, a bear with a deformed paw, a sinkhole that had distorted its print, anything. The first time I actually saw him, I was at the kitchen window around 11 at night. Brenna had gone to bed early. I was finishing the dishes. The window over the sink looks out at the back of the property, the workshop, the woodpile, and the trees beyond. I'd left the kitchen light on, which means anything outside would have been able to see me clear as day, and I would have to press my face to the glass to see anything more than my own reflection looking back at me. Something moved at the edge of the trees. It was just a shift in the dark, something you'd dismiss as a deer if you weren't already wound up the way I was. I cupped my hands around my eyes and pressed up against the window to cut the reflection. He was standing at the tree line, maybe 40 yards out. He was so still that for the first few seconds I thought I was looking at a tall stump, something your eye builds into a person at night when it's already primed to do that. But then his head turned, just his head, slowly, looking from his left to his right, scanning, and the proportions were wrong for a stump. Too tall, too narrow at the waist, shoulders too wide. He stopped scanning. He looked at the kitchen window. He looked at me. I want to be clear about this. The kitchen window is 40 yards from the tree line. The light inside was bright. The glass is single pane and reflects a lot. There is no rational way he should have been able to see me through that window. But he saw me. He looked at me, and I looked at him, and we held that look for I don't know how long. Long enough that the dish in my hand dripped soap onto the floor, and I didn't notice until later. He didn't move. He didn't make a sound. He just looked. Then he turned slowly and walked along the tree line, parallel to the cabin, until the woods swallowed him. He didn't go deeper into the trees. He didn't come closer. He walked the line, the way a sentry walks a perimeter. And in that moment, before I knew anything else about him, I had already started forming the conviction that this thing was here for us, that he was hunting us, that he was waiting for the right moment to do whatever the thing in the workshop track was going to do. I went to the bedroom, and I locked the door, and I lay next to Brenna, and I didn't sleep. I kept hearing footsteps in my head. I kept rehearsing what I'd do when he came up to the cabin, where my rifle was, how I'd position myself in the hallway, the angles, where the kids would be safest. I had it completely wrong. I see that now. The walking the tree line wasn't him hunting us. The walking the tree line was him on patrol, walking the line between the cabin and the depression, between us and the things behind the stone. He'd been doing that walk since before I was born. The only reason I'd seen him doing it that night was that I'd happened to be at the kitchen window at the right moment to catch him passing through that section of his beat. Banjo disappeared on the 5th night. He'd gone out to do his business around 11. We had him on the property, no leash, because we always did. He knew the boundaries. He never went past the workshop. He'd be back at the door in 5 minutes. He didn't come back. I went out with a flashlight at midnight, calling his name. I walked the whole property. The kids woke up. Brenna stayed inside with them. I walked all the way to the propane tank, and I almost walked further. But I stopped because I could feel the rise in the ground in front of me, and I knew the stone was on the other side of it. I went back to the cabin. I told Brenna we'd find him in the morning. She was crying. The kids were crying. I sat up in the kitchen with the rifle across my knees, and I watched the door until the sun came up. We searched all the next day. Hap came over and helped. We went out to about half a mile in every direction. There was no sign of Banjo, no fur, no blood, no body. He'd just gone. Hap pulled me aside at the end of the day. We were standing by my truck, and the sun was going down over the trees, and the air was getting cold. "Cal," he said, "you're going to find that dog. He's going to be in your workshop tomorrow morning. He's going to be scared. He's not going to be hurt. And after that, you're going to do what your grandfather did." I asked him how he knew. "Because it's already started," he said. "And the thing on your property is letting you know what'll happen to your family if you don't keep the arrangement. It's not threatening you. It's showing you. There's a difference." I asked him what the difference was. A threat is something it does to you. A demonstration is something it does for you. You don't see this yet, but you will. He drove home. I went inside and I lay on the couch and I didn't sleep. The next morning, when I went out to check the property at first light, Banjo was in the workshop. He was lying on a pile of canvas tarps in the back corner. The door had been closed when I went to bed, and the door was still closed when I opened it, with the latch fastened from the outside. I have no idea how he got in there. He was filthy. His coat was matted with mud and something dark that looked like blood, but turned out not to be blood when I washed him off, because blood doesn't come off like that. It looked like blood, but smelled like wet iron and old smoke and something else I didn't have a word for. It washed off with regular dish soap and water. There were no bite marks on him, no scratches. Whatever had brought him to the workshop had been careful with him. He was just spooked in a way I'd never seen him spooked before, looking past me when I crouched down, his eyes tracking something at the door behind my shoulder that wasn't there when I turned around to check. Banjo was alive. He was unhurt. He drank a whole bowl of water and ate a can of food, and then he slept for 16 hours straight. Brenna held me on the couch that morning while Banjo was sleeping in his bed, and she asked me what was happening. I almost told her about Hap, about the journal, about the stone. I didn't. I told her I thought there was a bear on the property and we should call animal control. She looked at me a long time and she said, "Cal, you've been lying to me for 2 weeks." She wasn't angry when she said it. She just sounded sad. "I'll tell you everything by the end of the week," I said. "I need to figure out what I'm telling you first." She nodded. She kissed my forehead. She went to take her shower and start her workday. I went out to the truck and I drove to Cadillac and I bought 20 pounds of venison from a butcher on M115. And on the way home, I drove past Hap's place and he was on the porch and he nodded at me and I nodded back. And that night, after the kids were in bed and Brenna was in the office on a late call, I wrapped the venison in clean cotton cloth, the way Erskine described in the 4th notebook, and I carried it out past the workshop and over the rise to the stone. It was about 11:30. The moon was almost full. The depression around the stone was darker than the rest of the property. The way ground that sits low always seems darker, even when there's no extra shadow to account for it. I set the bundle on top of the stone. I stepped back. I waited. Nothing happened. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, feeling like an idiot. And then I felt the air change. I don't know how else to describe it. The temperature didn't drop. The wind didn't shift. But the pressure changed. The way it changes when a big door opens in a building you didn't realize had a big door. And then, from the trees on the far side of the depression, maybe 40 yards away, something stepped out. I saw it for the first time then, fully, in the moonlight. It was every inch of 7.5 feet tall. It walked upright with a kind of forward lean, like a man carrying something heavy on his back. Its body was covered in fur so dark it ate the moonlight. But along its forearms and its chest, the fur was a little lighter, almost gray. The head was the head of a wolf, or a very large dog, longer in the muzzle than any breed I've ever seen, with ears that stood up tall and swiveled as it walked. Its eyes were yellow, not yellow like a flashlight reflection, yellow like a candle behind frosted glass, lit from inside. It walked to the stone. It moved on 2 legs the whole way. Its arms swung naturally at its sides. Its hands ended in fingers, just like Erskine's sketch, with claws that were dark and curved and as long as my middle finger. It stopped at the stone. It looked at the bundle of venison. Then it looked at me. I want to tell you, I held my ground. I want to tell you, I stood there like a man. The truth is my legs were shaking so hard, I thought they were going to dump me on the ground. But I didn't run. I didn't fall. I stood at the edge of the depression, about 30 feet from the stone, and I looked at the thing my great-grandfather had made an arrangement with 100 years ago. Its eyes were intelligent. That was the part that broke me. Not the size, not the teeth, not the smell of it, which had reached me by then and was a thick, heavy musk like a kennel mixed with the cold green smell of moss after rain. The eyes. They had thought behind them. They had memory. They looked at me, and I knew the thing was deciding something. It picked up the bundle of venison in one hand, just lifted it like a man lifting a sack of groceries. It turned its head, slowly, deliberately, and looked behind itself, into the trees on the far side of the depression. Then it looked back at me. I followed its gaze. I tried to see what it had seen. The trees on the far side of the depression were dark, but I thought, for just a second, that I saw movement. Not an animal. Movement that didn't have a shape attached to it, like a piece of darkness sliding sideways behind a tree trunk. There. Then, not there. The thing at the stone made a sound, low in its chest. It wasn't a growl, it was more like a hum, a note held in the throat for 2 or 3 seconds, and the movement on the far side of the depression stopped. It looked at me one more time, and then it turned and walked back into the trees, carrying the venison bundle, and it was gone. I stood there for a long time, maybe 10 minutes. Then I walked back to the cabin. I locked the door behind me. I sat on the couch in the dark, and I tried to slow my breathing down, and I waited for my legs to be willing to carry me to the bedroom. What I'd seen at the edge of the trees, on the far side of the depression, the thing without a shape that had slid out of sight when the watcher made the sound in its throat. That was the part that wouldn't leave me alone, because the watcher hadn't been warning me. It had been warning that thing, and what scared me wasn't that the watcher existed. It was that there was something behind it that the watcher itself was afraid of, or at least careful with, and that something had been close enough to come into the depression with me if the watcher hadn't been there. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table with the rifle across my knees and a cold mug of coffee, and I went over the whole thing in my head 100 times. The walkout, the bundle on the stone, the pressure shift in the air, the yellow eyes, the shape on the far side that wasn't an animal and wasn't a person and wasn't anything I had words for. By the time Brenna came down at 6 to make her own coffee, I'd decided I was going to drive to Hap's first thing, and I wasn't coming home until I had answers about what was past that stone. That night at the stone was Sunday, the end of week 3. The next morning I drove to Hap's. I didn't call ahead. He was on the porch when I pulled up, the way he always was, with the same chipped coffee mug. "You did the offering," he said. He didn't ask. He said it. I told him what I'd seen. All of it. The watcher coming out of the trees, the bundle of venison, the thing on the far side of the depression that slid out of sight when the watcher hummed. Hap nodded the whole way through. He didn't seem surprised by anything I told him. When I finished, he sat with his coffee for a long minute. Then he said, "You need to see what's out there, the rest of it, past the stone." I told him I didn't want to. "Nobody wants to," he said. "Your grandfather didn't want to. My old man didn't want to. But you got 2 kids in that cabin and a wife who already knows you're hiding something, and if you don't see it yourself, you'll never carry it right. You'll do the offerings because I told you to, and you'll be doing it on faith. That's not enough. Not for what your family's about to be living next to. You need to know what you're paying for." We went out at sunset. Hap brought a thermos of coffee and a flashlight he didn't turn on. He brought a hunting knife on his belt, which was useless against anything we were going to encounter. But I think he carried it for the same reason I'd brought my grandfather's rifle, which was also useless. We needed something heavy in our hands. We needed our hands to feel busy. We walked out past the workshop, past the propane tank, up the rise, and down into the depression. The stone was where it had been. The moon was a day past full, and the depression was lit in a cold, pale way that made every shadow look sharper than it should have. Hap stopped at the edge of the depression. He put his hand on my shoulder. "Past this point," he said, "the rules are different. You stay close to me. You don't speak. You don't run. If something comes near, you stand still. The watcher will come. The watcher knows we're out here. He always knows." I nodded. We crossed the depression, past the stone, up the other side of the rise, into the trees on the far side. I'd never been past the stone before. I want you to understand that. I'd been coming to that cabin for 30 years, and I'd never set foot on the other side of that depression. None of us had. My dad hadn't. My uncle hadn't. My cousins hadn't. The land past the stone was technically still our property for another 40 acres or so, and then it was the national forest, but in practice it was a place none of the Mercers ever went. I'd always assumed there was a swamp back there, or a steep grade. There wasn't. The land was just woods, the same as the rest of the property. Maples and birches and a few old-growth white pines. The same forest that grew on the side of the depression I knew, but the moment we crossed it, I felt the difference. The air thickened. It was like walking from the dry side of a hill into a fog bank, except there was no fog. The sounds of the night, the few that there were, faded. I could hear my own breathing and Hap's breathing, and that was about it. The smell changed. The clean, cold green smell of the rest of the forest dropped away, and underneath it was something heavier, something like old paper and damp stone, and something faintly chemical, like the residue of a fire that had burned out a long time ago in a closed room. We walked maybe 200 yards. Hap stopped. "Look," he said quietly. He pointed. Maybe 50 feet to our left, between two birches. There was a shape there. I want to be careful describing it because I'm not sure my eyes were giving me accurate information by that point. The shape was tall and thin and roughly humanoid. It stood very still. It was darker than the dark behind it, which shouldn't have been possible because dark is dark, but it was. It seemed to absorb light the way a hole absorbs water. I couldn't see a face on it. I couldn't see arms or legs precisely. It was more an absence in the shape of a person than a person. It didn't move. It watched us. I knew it was watching us the same way I'd known the watcher at the stone was watching me. Some part of my body that wasn't my eyes knew it was watching us. Hap pointed again, slightly behind us. There was another one. About the same height, the same shape. Maybe 70 feet back, near the edge of the depression we'd just crossed. A third one ahead of us, the farthest away. Maybe 100 feet, almost hidden in the trunks of the pines. I started counting. I got to 6 before Hap put his hand on my arm and shook his head. "Don't count them," he said. "They notice when you count them. Just look. Then we're going to walk back." I looked. The shapes weren't doing anything. They weren't advancing. They weren't speaking, though I had the strong sense that they were communicating with each other in some way that wasn't sound. They were just present. Present in a way that made the rest of the woods feel less present. The way a refrigerator hum makes the rest of a quiet house feel less quiet. There was a smell coming off them, sharper than the heavy smell of the air. Specific. Something I'd smelled once before in my life. When my grandfather Erskine had died, I'd flown up to help my dad clean out the house, and we'd opened a closet in my grandmother's old sewing room that had been closed since she died in 2009. The smell that had come out of that closet was the smell coming off these shapes, the smell of a sealed space that has been holding the same air for a very long time, and the air has changed slightly, the way air does, when it sits. I thought about my grandfather's notebooks, the Nephilim spirits, bound to places. Evil spirits upon the earth, the Book of Enoch had called them. They cause oppression and bring about destruction and cause hurt, and they're invisible. But they bind themselves to places, and at certain places they gather. And then one of them moved, the one ahead of us, the farthest one. It didn't walk. That's the part I keep going back to. It didn't take a step. It was 100 feet away, and then it was 60 feet away, and there was no transition between those two positions. It hadn't crossed the ground in between. It had just relocated. Hap's hand tightened on my arm. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He didn't even change his breathing. I could feel him standing there next to me, all 190 pounds of him, completely still, like a man waiting for a bee to fly out of his hood. The shape was closer now. Closer, I could see more of it. It wasn't humanoid the way I'd thought from a distance. The outline I'd taken for a head and shoulders was wrong somehow. The proportions were almost right, and then they weren't right. The way a face in a dream is almost a face you know, and then you look closer, and it isn't. Where the head should have been, there was a thicker patch of the darkness. Where arms should have been, there were vague suggestions of arms that didn't quite reach the ground, but didn't quite stop where arms stop either. It was as if something was trying to remember what a person looked like and was getting most of it, but not all. I had the urge to reach toward it, not because I wanted to. The urge came from outside me. It came from the shape. The same way a smell can make you hungry, whether you want to be hungry or not. The shape was pulling at something in me, some part of me that was lower than my conscious mind, and the part of me it was pulling at wanted to walk forward and touch it. Hap's hand on my arm was the only thing that kept me where I was. I felt him squeeze, very deliberately, 3 times. Pulse, 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 the way you might wake a sleeping man without scaring him. The pull faded slightly. Then the watcher hummed. I hadn't seen him come. He was behind us. The hum came from 20 feet behind my shoulder, deep and resonant, and the moment it started, every one of the shapes in the woods around us reacted. The closest one didn't relocate again. It receded, slowly this time, taking small jerking steps that weren't really steps. It sliding back from the position it had gained, returning to the 100-foot distance it had started at. The other shapes I could see in my peripheral vision did the same. They pulled back. They didn't disappear. They didn't run. They just gave us a little more room. The watcher hummed for maybe 10 seconds. The note was the same one I'd heard at the stone the night before, but longer, sustained, with a slight vibration in it that I could feel in the bones of my face. It wasn't a song. It wasn't language. It was more like a fence post being driven into the ground, a statement of territory. Up to here, no further. When he stopped, the woods stayed quiet. The shapes stayed back. Hap let out a breath. I think he'd been holding the whole time. "All right," he said very softly. "Now we walk back. Slow. Don't turn around to look. He'll be right behind us." I looked at him. "Hap, that thing was about to touch me." "It was," he said. "And he stopped it. That's what he does. Now walk." We walked. I want to tell you what it felt like, the walk back. 200 yards. It took us maybe 4 minutes. The whole time, I could feel the watcher behind us, close, his weight on the ground, his breathing slow and even. And I could feel the shapes on either side of us, in the trees, tracking our progress without being able to come closer. Like a man walking through a hostile crowd with a bodyguard. They wanted us. They were pressing at the edges of whatever permission the watcher's presence carried. But they couldn't cross it. About halfway back, I made the mistake of turning my head. Just a quick glance to the left. There was a shape there, maybe 30 feet away, keeping pace with us in the trees. And in the second I looked at it, it looked back. It didn't have a face. There was nothing there for me to look back at. But it looked back, and what I felt when it did was the same feeling I'd had standing in front of that closet in my grandmother's sewing room after Erskine died. The recognition that something was waiting inside there, that the inside of the closet had been listening to the outside of the closet for 15 years, and now the door was open, and what was in there had registered me. I turned my head forward again. I didn't look to the side anymore. There was something else about that walk that I didn't tell Brenna for a year, and I didn't tell Hap until 2 years later. About 150 yards into the walk back, near a fallen birch we were going to have to step over, I had a moment of clarity. A clarity you sometimes get in dreams, where everything you've been confused about resolves into a single picture. And the picture was this. The shapes in the trees, the ones the watcher was holding back, they weren't strangers to me. They weren't impersonal. They knew who I was. They knew my name. They had known my name before I was born. They had been waiting for me, specifically, for as long as Mercers had been on this land. And what they wanted from me wasn't a body. It wasn't a death. It was something more specific than that. They wanted me to come in. They wanted to ride me back to the cabin. They wanted to be inside the house where my wife and kids slept, looking out through my eyes, waiting for the right moment to do whatever it was they'd been waiting 100 years to do. I almost stopped walking when that hit me. Hap must have felt me stiffen. He squeezed my arm again, the 3 pulses, harder this time. "Walk," he whispered. "Don't think. Walk." I walked. I asked him later, when we were back in the cabin, if he'd had a moment like that on his walks. He nodded. "My father warned me. He said that was the part that would scare me most. Not the shapes, the fact that they know you, the fact that they've been waiting on you, personally, since before you were born." He took a long sip of his coffee. "They are very patient," he said. Hap squeezed my arm. "Time to go," he said again, louder this time, as if to himself. We turned. We walked back the way we'd come. I didn't look behind me. I wanted to. Every cell in my body wanted to. I didn't. We crossed the depression, past the stone, back up the rise on the cabin side, and the watcher was there. He'd been with us the whole time. I understood that as soon as I saw him. He was standing about 15 feet to our right, between the workshop and the propane tank, in the deep shadow against the cabin wall. I'd walked past him on the way out, and I hadn't seen him. I don't know how I didn't see him. He was 7.5 feet tall. Hap nodded at him. Just a small acknowledgement, the way you'd nod at a neighbor who'd held the door for you at the post office. The watcher nodded back. He didn't follow us inside. We went into the cabin, and I locked the door, and Hap and I sat at the kitchen table for an hour without saying much. We finished his thermos of coffee, then he stood up. "I'm going to head home," he said. "You have any questions? Come by tomorrow. But I think you know what you need to know." I asked him one thing before he left. "What are those things? The ones past the stone?" He stood at the door with his hand on the latch. He looked old in that moment, in a way he hadn't looked old before. Older than 78. Older than a man should look. Your grandfather thought they were what the Book of Enoch said they were. The spirits of the dead giants. The ones the flood killed. Their souls didn't have anywhere to go because they weren't fully human and they weren't fully angelic, so they wander. They gather at certain places. They try to get back into the world. Sometimes they manage. And that's where you get stories. Stories where a town goes bad. Where a piece of land everybody knew was wrong stays wrong for generations. Where things happen to people and nobody can explain it. He paused. I don't know if your grandfather was right. I'm not a scholar. I'm a guy who lives next to a piece of land that's got something underneath it. But I'll tell you this. I've been past that stone 4 times in my life. The first time was when I was 23 with my father. The second was when your grandfather first asked me to come out there with him in 74. The third was when your grandfather got sick last year and asked me to start doing the offerings. The fourth was tonight. And every single time, I've come back with the same feeling. Those things out there, they're not animals. They're not even alive in the way you and I understand the word. They're waiting. And they've been waiting a long time. And what's keeping them out is one creature, who your great-grandfather made an arrangement with 100 years ago. And the arrangement is that as long as the Mercer family keeps the cabin and keeps the offerings, the Watcher stays at that stone and keeps them out. He opened the door. You break the arrangement, he said, and they come through. Maybe not all at once. Maybe just one. Maybe just enough to bind itself to a person and ride them around for the rest of their life. But once that wall goes down, it doesn't go back up easy. He left. I stood at the door for a long time after his truck was gone. Then I went into the bedroom. Brenna was awake. The kids were asleep in their own beds for the first time in 2 weeks. She looked at me. Talk to me, she said. I talked. I sat down on the edge of the bed and I told her everything. The track, the first knock, the figure at the tree line, Hap's father, and the walk in 1971. The Lindemann family's half of the arrangement, the journal, the Book of Enoch, the Hebrew scholar, the night I'd left the venison and the Watcher had come out of the trees, the shapes past the depression and the one that had relocated, the walk back with Hap, the Watcher waiting for us in the shadow of the workshop. She listened the whole way through. She'd gotten out of bed at some point and was sitting on the floor in her robe with her back against the bed frame, hugging her knees. She didn't interrupt. The light through the window changed slowly. The room got grayer, then bluer, then there was a thin edge of sun coming up over the trees outside. When I finished, she sat with it for a long time. Then she said something I wasn't expecting. I've seen him too. I looked at her. She nodded like she'd been holding on to this. 2 weeks ago, I was making tea around 10:30 at night. The kitchen window. There was a shape at the edge of the trees, and I thought it was you. I almost went out to see what you were doing. Then I realized you were in the bedroom. By the time I looked again, it was gone. I told myself it was a tree I hadn't noticed. I was going to tell you, and then it didn't seem worth bringing up. I think I knew, Cal. Some part of me knew you weren't lying about the bear, but you were lying about something. I asked her why she hadn't said anything. Because if it was real, she said, I didn't want it to be, and I thought you were figuring it out, and I trusted you to tell me when you knew enough to say something I could do something about. We sat with that. I told her I was sorry. She shook her head. You don't get to be sorry, she said. We don't have time for that. Show me the journal. I showed her. She read for the rest of the night. By morning, she was as tired as I was, and she'd come to the same conclusion I had, which was that either we believed our own eyes or we didn't. We believed them. We talked about leaving. We sat with it for 2 days. We could sell the cabin, move the kids back to Grand Rapids, go back to looking at houses we couldn't afford. We could pretend we'd never been here, but Hap's words sat with us both. You break the arrangement and they come through. Maybe not right away, maybe not for years, but somewhere down the line, somebody else would buy this cabin, somebody who didn't know about the stone, somebody who didn't know about the offerings. The Watcher would hold his post for as long as he could, but without offerings, without the family being here, eventually he'd have to leave. And what was past the stone would come up to the cabin, and then to Hap's place, and then to whatever was past Hap's place. I'm not somebody who thinks of himself as having responsibilities to the world. I don't volunteer, I don't tithe, I do my job and I take care of my family, and I figure that's enough for one life. But sitting at that kitchen table with Brenna on the morning we made the decision, I thought about Maren, who was 6, and I thought about Hollis, who was 9. And I thought about whatever family would buy this place after we sold it. Some family with kids the same age as mine. Some family that didn't know what they were buying. We didn't sell. We made it a real cabin instead. A place we'd come up to 4 times a year, on the rough quarter days, to handle the offerings. Brenna negotiated with her job and got more flexible time. I took a contract position with a firm in Grand Rapids that let me work remote part of the year. Hollis and Maren would be homeschooled for half the year by the time they were teenagers, and they'd grow up knowing about the stone. We wouldn't put it off the way Erskine had with my dad. They'd carry it eventually, one of them, and they'd carry it knowing. We spent the rest of that first summer at the cabin. We finished the soft wall, we replaced the pump. We built a little stone path from the back porch to the workshop, so I wouldn't track mud through the kitchen during winter offerings. We taught the kids the rules. Don't go past the workshop after sunset. Don't make noise outside at night. If you ever see a tall figure at the edge of the trees, you don't run. You walk slowly back to the cabin, and you don't look back. If something knocks on the wall, you don't open the door, but you don't be afraid either, because the knocking is the watcher letting us know he's at his post. We told them the watcher's name, or what Erskine had decided to call him in the fourth notebook, which wasn't really a name, just a word in Old Hebrew that meant something like the one who keeps the gate. Erskine had spelled it phonetically in the notebook, so anyone in the family who read it later could say it the same way. We taught the kids the word. We don't say it out loud unless we need to, but Maren practices it sometimes when she's brushing her teeth, the way she practices the names of her stuffed animals. The watcher knows our names too. I don't know how I know that, but I know it. We've left the offerings every quarter since that first summer, 3 years now, and twice we've seen him on the way back from the stone, just at the edge of the trees, and both times he's nodded at us. Not the way he nodded at Hap, which was a working man's nod. The way he nods at us is different. There's something familial about it. He's been watching my family for 100 years. He watched my great-grandfather. He watched my grandfather. He watched my dad as a kid, even though my dad never saw him. He watches my kids now. And in the way that something so old can have feelings I'd recognize, I think he's fond of us. I think he understands that we're holding up our end of the arrangement, and he's grateful, and he wants us to keep doing it. Hollis was 10 when I took him to the stone for the first time. He'd been asking about it for months. He knew there was a place behind the workshop. He knew we went there 4 times a year. He knew the rules, that he wasn't allowed past the workshop after sunset until he was old enough. He asked me finally in the October of that second year if he was old enough yet. I asked him why he wanted to know. He said, "Because if it's important to our family, I want to be the one who does it, after you." Brenna and I talked about it that night. She was quieter than I'd expected. Then she said, "He's not asking to be brave. He's asking to be useful. There's a difference." And she was right, the same way Hap had been right about the difference between a threat and a demonstration. The December offering that year, Hollis came with me. He was 10, and he was small for his age, and he was carrying half the bundle, with the other half in my arms. The snow was already deep, maybe a foot, and we'd shoveled a path from the cabin to the workshop and past it. Past the workshop, the snow was untouched. We made fresh tracks. Hollis's boots were too big for him because he was growing fast, and Brenna refused to buy boots that fit only one season. We set the bundle on the stone. I stepped back the way I always did. Hollis stood next to me. I'd told him what to expect. I'd told him not to move and not to look away. The watcher came out of the trees. He was the same. He was always the same. The yellow eyes, the heavy walk, the lean. He looked at me first. He nodded. Then he looked at Hollis. I'd known he was going to do that. I'd been preparing for it for weeks. I'd told Hollis the watcher would acknowledge him, and that the acknowledgement would feel like a weight, and that he should accept the weight without flinching. Hollis didn't flinch. He looked back at the watcher with the steady focus of a kid who has decided, by some private internal vote, that he can do this. The watcher held his gaze for maybe 4 seconds. Then he nodded at Hollis, the same nod he'd been giving me, and he picked up the bundle and walked back into the trees. We walked back to the cabin. Hollis didn't say anything until we were on the porch. "He's tired," he said. I asked him what he meant. His eyes, "He's been doing this a long time. He's really tired." I hadn't ever said anything to Hollis about the tiredness in the watcher's eyes. I'd noticed it the first time I'd seen them, and I'd thought about it 100 times since, but I'd never said it out loud, not even to Brenna. Hollis had seen it on his own. He'd seen it the first time he'd looked at the thing. We came in, we had cocoa. Hollis went to bed early. Brenna asked me how it had gone, and I told her, and she sat at the kitchen table for a long time after I'd gone to bed myself. I think she was thinking about her 10-year-old kid being old enough to see something I hadn't expected anyone to see. There's more I haven't said, and I want to say it before I close this out, because there are pieces of this story that have been weighing on me. The first piece is what happened to Erskine at the end. The official cause was pancreatic cancer. That was true. The cancer was real, and it killed him, and that's a fact you could put on a death certificate. but Erskine knew he was sick 6 months before he told anyone. I found his medical records in the same drawer as the notebooks, after we decided to stay. He'd been diagnosed in October. He didn't tell my dad until April. The records show a follow-up appointment scheduled for November that he never went to. In the back of the fourth notebook, the one labeled Arrangement, there's an entry dated November 14th, 2024. The handwriting is shaky. The entry is one line. He came to the porch tonight. First time. He knew before I told anyone. That's it. He came to the porch. The watcher had stepped out of the woods and come up to my grandfather's porch. The same porch where I'd sat with Brenna 100 times drinking coffee, and Erskine had known what it meant. The watcher had come to say goodbye, or to acknowledge that the arrangement was about to pass to someone new. Erskine had spent 50 years holding up his end, and at the end, the watcher had walked out of the woods to mark it. Then below it, dated 3 weeks later, there was a second entry, longer, in handwriting that was barely legible. He came again last night, sat at the bottom of the porch steps, did not approach. We looked at each other for about an hour. I tried to thank him. I don't know if he understood the words. I think he understood the feeling behind them. He left around 3 a.m. I think he will come more often now. I am not afraid. I am sorry I am leaving the post unfilled. I trust the next one to find his way. I hope my grandson, if any of them comes, will not curse me for never explaining. That entry was the last one in any of the notebooks. There were blank pages after it. Erskine had bought that final notebook in 1971 with the assumption that he would fill it. He'd kept it open for 53 years and he'd filled it only halfway. The rest of the pages were waiting for whoever picked it up next. I think about that a lot. I think about who will come to my porch eventually. I think about whether my kids will be there. The second piece is something Hap told me about 6 months ago. We were sitting on his porch in the late fall, watching the first snow come down. He'd been quiet for a while. Then he said, "My old man, the one who took your grandfather out past the stone in 71. He didn't die natural. Did you know that?" I didn't. "Officially, he died of heart failure," Hap said. "In 83. He was 66. But I was there at the end. I was in the bedroom with him. He'd been sick a while. He was lucid right up until the last hour, and in that last hour he started talking, not to me, to somebody in the room with us that I couldn't see. He was answering questions, he was laughing even, and right before he went, he looked over at the corner of the room where there wasn't anything. And he smiled the kind of smile a man smiles when he sees an old friend, and he said, 'I figured it'd be you.'" Hap took a sip of his coffee. "I never told anybody that," he said. "Not your grandfather, not anybody. I'm telling you because you should know. The Watcher doesn't just keep the bad things out. He keeps the people who hold the arrangement too. He comes for them at the end. Or somebody comes for them, and it's somebody friendly. I don't know what that means theologically. I don't know what it means about who the Watcher really is. But I know what I saw in my father's bedroom in 1983. And I know that whoever he saw in that corner, he was glad to see them. I think about that too. I don't have a frame for it. The Book of Enoch talks about the Watchers as fallen angels who were punished. It doesn't say much about the lowercase Watchers, the ones my grandfather thought existed, the ones who were sent to guard the seams. Maybe they're something more than what Erskine thought they were. Maybe they're not just jailers. Maybe they're also, at the end, something else. Witnesses, companions, friends. I don't know. I'm not a religious man, and I'm not going to pretend I am now just because I've seen something I can't explain. The third piece, the last piece, is about Banjo. Banjo died in February. He was 15. He'd had a good run. The vet said it was kidney failure, and that the kindest thing was to put him down. And we did, at home, on the rug in front of the fireplace, with Hollis and Marin both with him at the end. It was peaceful. It was the way you want your old dog to go. I buried him out behind the workshop, not at the stone, just in the regular yard, in a spot Brenna picked because it got the morning sun. 3 days later, I went out to fill the bird feeder, and I saw that the dirt over Banjo's grave had been disturbed, not dug up, just brushed flat, the way you'd smooth a sheet. And on top of the smooth dirt was a single white stone, about the size of an egg. Not a stone from our property. Our property has gray granite. This was white quartz, polished smooth. It had been set in the center of the grave. I knew who'd done it. Brenna knew. Hollis and Marin, when I showed them, knew. The Watcher knew about Banjo. He'd known when Banjo had disappeared in our first summer here and ended up locked in the workshop, and he'd known when Banjo died this year, and he'd come up to the cabin and marked the grave. Not because he had to, just because he wanted to. I keep the white stone in my pocket now. I take it out sometimes when I'm sitting at the kitchen table thinking about what we're doing up here. I run my thumb over it. It's smooth in a way nature doesn't quite manage. Whatever polished it carefully. I don't know how to end this. I don't think it ends. Brenna and I are going to keep coming up to the cabin 4 times a year for as long as we can. Hollis is 12 now and starting to understand what we're doing here. Marin is 9 and has known since she was 6. We don't hide it from them. We don't make it scary. We make it ordinary, the way it was for Erskine. You do the chores, you patch the roof, you leave the venison at the stone. You don't go past the workshop after dark. You don't worry about the knocks. The watcher is at his post. If you're reading this and you've inherited a piece of land in the middle of nowhere from a relative who never quite explained why it was so important to keep it, I want you to think hard before you sell. Walk the property. Look for stones that don't belong. Look for marks. Talk to the neighbors. Talk to the old ones. Find out if your family had an arrangement you didn't know about. And if your dog stands at the door at night looking at something you can't see, don't grab the rifle. Don't get clever. Don't go Googling cryptids the next morning, the way I did, with the certainty that you're going to debunk it. Just stand still. Watch. Let the thing in the trees show itself if it wants to. And if it does, look at its eyes. And if there's thought behind them, if there's something there that's been doing a hard job for a long, long time, you nod. You go inside. You don't open the door no matter what knocks. And when you're ready, you go find out what your family promised. Because whatever it is, it's still in force. And whatever's on the other side of it has been waiting 100 years for somebody to stop holding the line. The watcher walks the property every night. He still does. I hear him sometimes. The slow, heavy steps in the dark. The faint hum in his throat when something on the far side of the depression gets too close. Brenna and I have stopped flinching at the sound. The kid's never started. He's out there now. As I'm telling you this. Walking the line my great-grandfather drew. Keeping the seam closed, holding up his end of an arrangement that nobody alive remembers being made. I sleep better than I did the first 3 weeks of that first summer. Some nights, I sleep better than I ever have anywhere else in my life, because I know what's out there, and I know what's beyond it, and I know what stands between them and us. And the thing standing between them and us, the thing I was about to put a bullet through, the thing I thought was the worst thing I'd ever encountered in my life, isn't even close to the worst thing in those woods. He's just the only thing keeping the worst thing out. And as long as my family keeps our promise, he'll keep his. I think that's the whole story, or as much of it as I can tell. There are details I've left out, mostly to protect the property and the family, and a few details I've left out because I don't fully trust them yet. Things I might tell another night when I've sat with them longer. But the shape of it is the truth. A track at a workshop corner. A stone behind a cabin. A journal in a desk drawer. A neighbor who'd been waiting 50 years for somebody to ask the right question. A creature 7.5 feet tall, with the head of a wolf and the eyes of something that has been doing the same job since before any of us were born. And a small white stone, set carefully on the grave of an old dog, by a hand that wasn't human. That's where I'll leave it. The arrangement holds. The watcher walks. And every quarter, when the moon is right, my family carries a bundle out past the workshop, over the rise, down into the depression, and sets it on the stone. He always comes for it. He always nods. And then we go back inside, and we lock the door, and we listen to the woods, and we sleep.